Good to see you today. Nice to see a fairly full room this morning. We are in week 3 of our Lake Life series today. We're just going to jump right into it because I got quite a bit of content for us this morning. So about 3 weeks ago, I was reading through the book of 1 Peter. And these words in chapter 4 really grabbed me. Verse 12 through 13, it says, "Dear friends, do not be surprised by the fiery ordeal that has come on to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed." So working off Peter's instructions, particularly in verse 12, let me ask you, how many of you, when a fiery ordeal begins, thought, "Oh, I'm not surprised at all by this. Thank you, God, for the opportunity to rejoice"? You know, when a diagnosis is made, a financial loss is incurred, a loss of employment, a struggle in your marriage, a pain in your children's life, you think, "I'm not surprised at all about this." I think if we're being honest, most often we are surprised at the trials we face as if something strange were happening to us. And rather than saying, "I saw this coming, I'm not surprised this is happening," Christians tend to say, "It's not supposed to be this way. I thought that if I served God and raised my children to serve him and I went to church and I tithed, he would bless my life and he would take care of me trial-free. If I did my part, God would certainly hold up his end of the bargain." If you're anything like me, I suspect you have often been surprised by the fiery ordeals, both the little candle flame fiery ordeals and like the 5-alarm blazes. In fact, I think one of the hardest lessons in my personal faith life has been learning that God doesn't owe me anything for good behavior and for sacrifice. Nor was good behavior and sacrifice a guarantee for an easy, trial-free life. Again, this may resonate with some of you. It seems that us people have a tendency to believe that Christian discipleship is sort of a bargaining chip with God. And if we do the right things, then God will do what we believe are the right things, and he'll keep us from trial. This posture is what author Skye Jethani calls life under God. It is a life under God posture. So he summarizes this posture like this: the life under God posture sees God in simple cause and effect terms. We obey his commands, and he blesses our lives, our families, our nation. And our primary role is to determine what he approves or disapproves and work vigilantly to remain within those boundaries. Cause and effect. I do this, this is the result. Again, anyone relate to living like this? Jethani goes on to explain that this posture is ultimately about trying to gain control over the unpredictable events that may be in our life. If we believe that we live a life pleasing to God, then we should expect to enjoy an easier life than the unrepentant sinner. Therefore, control is gained through this cause and effect expectations dynamic of really a distorted belief system. Now, I think we would agree, at least on we can't control God. While knowing and serving and living life with God absolutely has countless blessings, controlling God as one of the relationship with him is just not one of the benefits. And living as if he can control him is at least one of the reasons we are so often surprised when a fiery ordeal comes. Even if this is just a subconscious perception we have of our faith life. You see, it's not that we don't believe hard times come, it's just we believe that we do enough to avoid them in our own lives. So because I am confident many of us have, currently are, and will again wrestle with living under God as a way to control our futures, therefore we will do the opposite of what Peter says, and we will become surprised, and we will struggle to rejoice when these strange trials come upon us. Because of all that, I want to once again look at a story on the lake. When Jesus' followers found themselves surprised by what they were facing, surprised by Jesus' response, and then in turn learned a few lessons that are still needed today. You can turn to Mark 4, beginning in verse 35. This is one of those Sunday school stories that we think we know. So we're going to work through it today and see if we can find something new. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. There were also other boats with them. A furious squall came up, and waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So another story of finding life on the lake, albeit in a rather disconcerting boat ride. We're only 3 weeks into this series, but it seems fair to say that these boat rides with Jesus on the Sea of Galilee were anything but predictable for these disciples. Simon and some of the other apostles who are present in this story had been through the miraculous catch of fish we just talked about a couple weeks ago. You remember, there's so many fish, the boats begin to sink. They are concerned for their well-being. And then we have this story. And so I think combining these occasions where these people genuinely feared for their lives every time they got in a boat with Jesus, it must have been that they were always on edge anytime Jesus was around a boat. And they walked around a lot. They were often on the shoreline. We can imagine anytime there was just a boat reasonably close to Jesus, they thought, "Oh boy, here we go again." We can imagine Jesus saying to them, "Okay, boys, let's go for a boat ride." Them all sort of awkwardly looking around, looking at the ground, looking at each other. Should we get in the boat? I wonder what trick Jesus has up his robe, this time. But they go, amazingly. They go. And though the lessons were always scary, always, they were always worth it. And this lesson on the lake is one in which Jesus calls again his followers into an even greater faith in him by demonstrating his peaceful presence and his power during a very scary and perhaps even surprising storm. So our first point this morning is this, that obedience to Jesus didn't create calm water. Obedience to Jesus didn't create calm water. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There's other boats with them, and a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. So Mark tells us that as the day is winding down, Jesus says to the disciples, "Let's go to the other side," which is the other side of the Sea of Galilee. This wasn't a suggestion that Jesus was making. He wasn't asking. This is a command to move from where they are to the other side. Now, the other side of the lake was predominantly a Gentile region. If you flip to Mark chapter 5, you're going to find that Jesus encounters a naked, demon-possessed man on the other side of the lake. This wasn't a peaceful place. This wasn't an easy living resort-type town. It was a Gentile region. Being Jews, they knew what was over there. And Jesus gave no explanation for why they were to go. He just said, let's go to the other side. And so putting this together, we have Jesus asking the disciples to travel late in the day to a region that likely wasn't their favorite, and they are to do so without any explanation as to why. Now, to add to that, the apostles knew a little bit about this lake, this Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee lies nearly 700 feet below sea level. And on one side, it is surrounded by hills and mountains that are especially steep, almost forming walls. 30 miles to the northeast is the location of Mount Hermon, which sits 9,200 feet above sea level. And so what happens to this day is cold wind from way up on Mount Hermon makes its way down and collides with the warm air that is rising from 700 feet below sea level. And it creates chaos to this day. Even today, the early evening wind coming from the east is known as sharkia, which is the Arabic word for shark, because it can lead to such dangerous outcomes. So not only are these disciples being asked to travel late in the day to some undesirable part of their region, with no reason as to why they are going, Jesus wants to set out when the shark wind blows. But because I suppose they are less afraid of shark winds than I am, they agree, and so they go. Or maybe they went because Jesus asked, not because they were brave. And maybe, and I don't want to speculate too much here, but maybe they went with their concerns, but they checked them sort of at the dock because they believed that because Jesus asked and they obeyed, it would certainly be okay. But that's actually not what happens at all. It wasn't okay. The story ends well, everyone's fine, but for a moment, the disciples are in very real danger. At least it seems that way to them. They're stressed, they're fearing for their lives, and remember whose idea this was. It's Jesus. It's Jesus who asked to go out on the water when the shark winds blow. It was Jesus who ultimately got them into this mess. And again, I don't want to speculate, but perhaps, even for a moment, they blamed Jesus and they regretted obeying him because they expected more from him in a moment like this. The good news is through the experience and the feelings, the disciples learned something. They learned a lesson that anyone living their life with the under God posture needs to learn. And probably, maybe I'll just speak for myself, but maybe you relate more than once. And that's that obeying Jesus' commands doesn't always create calm water. Too often we believe that obedience to Jesus should mean smooth sailing. We believe that if we listen to him and we go where he asks, when he asks, and we take risks and we make sacrifices for his sake, then surely he will help us avoid those surprise storms with shark winds. But that's just not true. Sometimes it's actually the complete opposite. Sometimes doing what Jesus asks will lead us directly into very real trial and very real challenge. A life and legacy that unmistakably illustrates this is that of missionary martyr Jim Elliot. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Jim Elliot's story. I think I've even talked about him here before. In fact, I know I have. And I'm actually glad that Brad and Wendy are here today because Richard File loved Jim Elliot. And I can remember talking about Jim Elliot and getting emails from Richard about how much he loved him and what his ministry had meant to him. So let me just refresh his story for you, or perhaps tell you for the first time. In the mid-1900s, Jim and his wife Elizabeth felt called as missionaries to the unreached tribes of Ecuador. Violent tribes that were known for killing anyone that came into their territory. And after much prayer and preparation, learning the language, jungle lessons so that they could survive, and a clear conviction that God was asking them to go, Jim, along with some colleagues, made their way to Ecuador. And they made contact with those they felt God had called them to reach. Now, they knew they'd be violent, and they knew that they needed to sort of develop some trust. And so for like a significant amount of time, they would fly over with a plane and drop gifts drop supplies, drop things from the plane to tell these people that it will be okay. And then eventually even these people sent a gift back up, seemingly as sort of an act of friendship. It's okay, come on in. So eventually the day comes, they land the plane and they get out of the plane and they start to make their way. They see two women come out of the jungle and they realize these women don't seem friendly. Next thing they know, they hear a scream from behind them, and they turn around, and every warrior in the village is armed with a spear. Next thing they know, they're dead. They kill them. All of them. Pilate and everybody else. They're all killed. Nearly a decade before this tragic event, Jim Elliot wrote this in his journal, what has become really his most famous words. He said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And how true these words would become of Jim Elliot. 10 years in between this journal entry and his death in 1958. Today, Jim Elliot's life is both inspiring and it's challenging to the Christian who believes if they give it all to God, storms will be mostly avoided. Jim gave it all to God, literally. And he died at the hands of the ones that God asked him to go to. Now, Jim wasn't single. He also had a wife, Elizabeth, and a young daughter. Elizabeth, in Jim's obedience, had left her a widow and the child without a father. If Jim's storm was momentary, Elizabeth's in some ways was for all of her life. And so Elizabeth's response to this surprising storm is maybe even more worth our time to consider. So Elizabeth was also one to journal. She wrote these words at age 21. "My life is on thy altar, Lord, for thee to consume. Set the fire, Father. Bind me with cords of love to the altar. Hold me there. Let me remember the cross." Amazingly, this prayer was answered. And even though a severe storm had come her way, she never left the altar. And she continued to live as a sacrifice. And here's a description of her life and sacrifice, really her response to what happened to her husband. This is taken right from her website. Elizabeth took her toddler daughter, snake bite kit, Bible, and journal, and lived in the jungle with the Stone Age people who killed her husband. Compelled by her friendship and forgiveness, many came to faith in Jesus. Jim and Elizabeth Elliot are contemporary heroes of the faith, but I suspect they would reject that designation. They were ordinary people who knew and accepted the lessons that Jesus' disciples learn. And in particular, the lesson that is obedience to Jesus doesn't create calm water. But the earliest disciples and the contemporary ones, known as Jim and Elizabeth, came to learn another lesson. And that's this, that Jesus is a peaceful participant even in the storm. Jesus was in the stern sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" I mean, what contrast. Jesus is asleep and they're asking, "Aren't you going to do anything? We're about to die." So the disciples and Jesus, they're making their way across the lake and a storm comes up, and to make matters worse, Jesus, the one that they clearly believed could help them here, is asleep. Interestingly, the storm here and Jesus being asleep, this is the only place in the Gospels we hear of Jesus asleep. He's right in the middle of this storm. The only place we read about Jesus dozing off is in the middle of a terrifying, chaotic, and life-threatening storm. Now, perhaps some of you find this surprising. Maybe others find it interesting. And perhaps there's others here that don't find it so hard to believe because you feel like Jesus is always asleep in your storm. Therefore, it's not interesting or surprising because it just feels common. And I understand feeling this way. I could be wrong, but I suspect every single time this verse is read in a church, some of the congregation very quickly and very easily places themselves in this story. Personal crisis has hit. The waves of the fiery ordeal are smashing against you. They're threatening to sink you. And to make matters worse, you can't figure out what Jesus is doing. Like the disciples in this story, you know Jesus is sailing with you, but you also feel like he is asleep when you need him most. And this has left you feeling then like you don't know what to say, you don't know what to do, you don't even know how to pray in such a way that you can rouse Jesus from his slumber and move him to act in your storm. Anyone relate to that? I suspect some of you do. So let's consider this verse a little further, because it seems that even if we can come to a place where we learn and accept that storms are a part of the Christian life, and doing all the right religious things doesn't ensure calm waters, even if we come to believe Jesus journeys with us, there is something to learn about Jesus as our storm sailing companion. And that is that Jesus isn't asleep in the storms because he's uninterested, because he isn't concerned, or because he's removed himself from the problem. That's not why Jesus is asleep. Rather, Jesus is at peace to the place that he can rest because he knows the power of God. That's what's taking place in this story. And because he knows all of that power of God, the storm doesn't terrify him. So much so that it seems to have relaxed him. You see, we want and expect Jesus to respond to storms like we do. We see the disciples do this here. But we see that Jesus doesn't respond to storms like we do. And he's not going to start responding to storms like we do because it's 2022 and we figured something new out. When a storm arises, Jesus is with us in it. But unlike us, he isn't hasty, he isn't panicked, he isn't terrified, he isn't scrambled, he doesn't lose sleep. He finds sleep. And he doesn't insist that order be instantly resolved and brought back into life, otherwise he's going to walk out on the whole thing. We learn that Jesus is at rest when people are terrified. Now, this calm, peaceful, and restful behavior of Jesus can really drive his followers crazy, both past and present. And we see the common human response in the second half of verse 38. Teacher, don't you care? I'm drowning. Jesus, don't you care that this storm might take me out? I suspect every single person in this room has asked of God, don't you care? It's surely a question that reveals the human expectation that storms are not a time for peace and rest. You know, there's actually a harshness, a rudeness in the disciples' question here. The English doesn't capture it. It often lets us down. But in the original language, there's frustration, there's harshness in the question. They want Jesus to behave different in the storm than he is behaving. And we understand this. We understand what it feels to almost be harsh with Jesus when we don't get what he's doing. But I hope we agree that the ones needing to change are the disciples, not Jesus. Jesus isn't the one who needs to correct himself here. It's the panic-stricken disciples. The disciples are the ones that need to learn that Jesus isn't ever quiet or restful because he is indifferent. If Jesus is quiet in the storm, it's because he's at peace in the storm. Because even in the worst of storms, he knows something that we don't. And that detail should give us pause then. The next time we begin to accuse Jesus of indifference and lack of care for us in our storm. Because a quiet and still Jesus in our storm is not indifferent. He's at peace. He's at rest. And this is ultimately what we should want in a companion that is going to navigate a storm with us. I'm not sure if you've noticed this, but when a surprise storm comes up in our lives, the friend that loses their mind in fear and panic and chaotically starts finding a solution for us as quickly as they can, this friend often makes things worse, not better. And you know this when you get that bad news, again, whether it's a diagnosis or you've lost your job or some crisis is happening in your marriage or your kids are struggling with something, you're very careful who you tell that to. Because not everybody reacts the same way. There's certain people you trust with your storms, and there's certain people you don't. And I think you would agree the people we want are the peaceful ones. The ones who just hear the problem. The ones who hear the storm and are happy to sit with us in the storm for a moment before putting on their Captain Solution hat and figuring it all out for us as quickly as they can. Sometimes we just need the calm because there's already enough storm going on. I mean, the disciples mimic the behavior of the chaos. Meanwhile, Jesus is operating completely in a different spirit. Totally different. And so though we don't always understand, and therefore sometimes we feel frustrated with Jesus for being so peaceful when we're panicked, let's not forget to celebrate and thank God that Jesus is with us as a peaceful companion who knows an answer will come. Rather than the panicked friend who faces the storms completely as a human being, rather than as God in the flesh. Now, the lessons Jesus gave on the lake don't stop at this peaceful participation. Jesus does act. And his answer to the disciples' question of, "Don't you care if we drown?" wasn't to say, "Oh, hold on, boys, the storm will pass." And he might say that sometimes, but that's not what he does here. In this instance, Jesus answers with a miraculous demonstration of God's power, because that's what Jesus knew that their faith in that moment needed. And so as we wrap this sermon up, let's consider this one final point. It is simple. It's the most simple thing I will say, but it is maybe the most important. Jesus has the power to calm storms. Jesus has the power to calm storms. He got up. Storms hate it when Jesus gets up. And he rebuked the wind, and he said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified. Now they're even more afraid. And that's the way it should be. Fear of God should trump everything. "Who is this?" they ask. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." As I was preparing this message, I read these verses multiple times. I always do when I'm, of course, preparing. You can't help it. You're in them all week. And the more I read these words, the more I almost became sad and convicted that we have become so familiar with the account of Jesus calming the storm that we're no longer amazed at what he did. We fail to experience any wonder when we hear that in a single word, Jesus brought the wind to a breeze and the waves to a watery whisper. Quiet. Be still. In a word, Jesus silenced a physical display of nature's chaos. This story is so familiar to us, especially those of us that have been in the church a long time, it doesn't even really sink in anymore. We seem to be deaf or indifferent to the simple but powerful truth that is, Jesus calms storms. Jesus silences winds. Jesus hushes waves. Jesus speaks to storms and they listen to him. You know, if any of you were going through a severe crisis, and I came to comfort you and I simply said, "Jesus calms storms," you'd say, "Tell me something that helps." Our response to Jesus calms storms is often, "Yeah, I know." Or at worst, "Yeah, I doubt it." When it comes to human hardships, I confess, I am concerned we have become so skeptical, cynical, and comfortable with human rationality. We choose rationality of our silly minds over the miracles of God, as this is a better act of comfort. I don't know what planet we're living on. We can't easily, church, find the gospel in the testimony that Jesus calmed storms. We got to work at it a little bit. So what we're going to do to wrap this whole thing up is consider for a moment or two here why Jesus calming a literal storm really did matter to these disciples. Like, really did matter. Changed their lives, left them terrified, going, who on earth is this? What don't I know? And then we're going to finish by considering why we can still trust Jesus to silence our storms too. Okay. I even pray in this moment that by way of the Holy Spirit, we would begin to recover a sense of wonder, not cynicism, at the Jesus who calms storms. In Jesus' name. Soften our seared hearts. Soften our hard-to-impress minds, God, I pray even in this moment. So why did Jesus silencing the storm matter to the disciples in the boat? Well, I know for sure it wasn't because he did a cool trick that allowed them to get on with their lives, which is mostly how we want Jesus to intervene. We want the disruption gone. We don't necessarily want a greater revelation. But this mattered to the disciples because of what this action of power revealed to them. You see, in Jewish tradition, the one who ruled the winds and the sea was God himself. Look at Psalm 107. I preached on this passage a couple months ago. He stilled the storm to a whisper, and the waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. He stilled the storm to a whisper, and the waves of the sea were hushed, and they were glad when it grew calm. This is but one reference of God commanding the wind and the water in the Old Testament. For generations, Jewish faith believed that God and God alone was the one who commanded storms to be still. It's not out of the question that on this day, some in the boat had this psalm memorized. So when Jesus speaks to the storm and it listens to him, when he speaks to the wind and it listens to him, when he speaks to the waves and they listen to him, these faithful Jews realize this isn't just a special magician in the boat today. This isn't just a teacher with some cool tricks. This is God incarnate standing in our boat. It was the Lord that is traveling with us this day. And we better believe this mattered. In the moment of this realization then, as they're standing there observing this, Jesus asks them two rhetorical but very appropriate questions. He asks the disciples, why are you afraid? And he asks, do you still not have faith? And though these are questions, they are also really simple teaching for disciples of Jesus, because these questions say something. These questions preach, we might say. They say that because Jesus is God, he rides with us in storms, his followers can and his followers should know a very special and significant boldness in storms that other people have yet to find. And it also teaches that disciples of Jesus must come to trust in God's ability to bring them through the worst of storms when they arise. Boldness and confidence, boldness and faith, boldness and trust in God should define people who are going to ride in storms with Jesus Christ. And so perhaps today Jesus is asking you, why are you so afraid? What a question to be asked by Jesus. Why are you so afraid? Do you still not have faith? And in response to the revelation of Jesus as God with us, the questions Jesus asks these disciples leave them almost speechless, except for a question of their own. Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? Who is this man? These men were still learning who this man was. They had some time in front of them to continue to figure out who exactly this Jesus was. And perhaps today we are figuring that out too. We do have the benefit of looking backwards, but perhaps we're still figuring this out too. And so to conclude now everything I've said with a little bit of application, I want to come back to our potential indifference to Jesus' ability to calm wind and waves in our life, both the literal and even the figurative types as well. I am aware that believing that God is with us as a peaceful presence in our storms and that He's able to silence those storms is of little help to the person who feels that they can't get Jesus to wake up. You can know He's with you and you can know He's at peace, but that's not always helpful when you feel like you can't get Him to pay attention. And so I want to wrap up today that with this thought, that though you may feel as though Jesus mostly sleeps rather than acts in your life, and I'm sorry if you feel that way today. I've been there. It's not true. And sometimes we just need a brother or sister to tell us that. It's not true. It's not true. It's not true for you. It's not true for me. It's not true for any of us. Just as the disciples were given a demonstration so that they could know a new boldness and a new faith in all of their life, in all of their trials, we too, sometimes we forget, but we too have seen God's power in a storm. You see, today Jesus has already silenced the greatest storm you will ever face. He silenced the storm that is the consequence of your sin and the death that should have been yours. In Mark 4, we only see what Jesus did in full through His cross and resurrection in part. This is just a taste in Mark 4 of something so much greater that would come. This story in Mark, as good as it is, it only gave these disciples and anyone who would read it today a taste of the power of God that conquers the forces of evil and chaos, that comes against His people and comes against God's Son. But the full taste is found only in the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is available to you right now. It's yours. And I haven't shared this detail until now, but this story in Mark 4 has some intentional and interesting parallels with the Old Testament story of Jonah. The language in certain places is almost identical. So if you know the story of Jonah, you know that like Jesus, Jonah was sleeping through a storm while they were at sea. And Jonah is awakened by sailors who are terrified that they're going to die. And finally, after Jonah agrees to be thrown into the sea, the storm is calmed, and this sudden change in the weather leads to fear and awe, wonder among the people who are on the boat. And so Jesus then is like a type of Jonah, taking on the storm for the sake of other people. But He's not equal to Jonah. He's not just like Jonah, He's greater than Jonah. And He said so Himself. And He said so with a warning to people who would come close to Him. In Matthew 12:41, Jesus said this, "The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation, and they will condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah," talking about Himself, "is here. And they're not repenting," is essentially what Jesus, they're not paying attention. They're not responding to what they have. And so, church, like Jonah, Jesus calmed wind and waves on the seas. And like Jonah, He came preaching truth. But Jesus did something greater than Jonah. He conquered a far greater storm, and He had a far greater truth to preach. He calmed winds and waves of sin and death by throwing Himself into a storm of hell and rising again on the third day. And He preached free grace and forgiveness by simple belief in Him. And if we can't be impressed that Jesus calmed a storm of nature anymore, then let us look to the cross and the empty tomb where even a greater storm was calmed. In fact, I'm convinced the only way that we can face the storms of life is by staring at the storm of Calvary and going from there. You see, we're so fortunate to be the generation that has the cross and the empty tomb as an interpretive lens for the storms of life, rather than having just the storms of life speak to the rest of life and perhaps even just interpret what Jesus did on the cross. We can have the greatest storm we will ever face calmed. And I believe most of us in this room, if not all of us, already have. And yet we can resent and reject Jesus because a far smaller storm wasn't dealt with the way that we demanded it would be. And so let's make sure we don't become so focused on the solution to our small storm that we fail to see the greater solution to the storm that is sin and death, which has already been silenced. Jesus made no promises that storms would be avoided. Therefore, we should not be surprised when they come to us. But he did promise, and he already has shown us he will sail with us in those storms as a peaceful presence and as the only one with the power to silence the seas of trouble when we sometimes travel through them, because he's conquered the greatest storm that we will ever face. And if you believe this, then today's not a day to despair, even if the storm is heavy for you. Rather, it is, as Peter said, actually a day to rejoice. So rejoice, then, that the storm of all storms has been made still, and it still preaches to you and to me a boldness and faith for all of life to those who are willing to behold it for what it is. Rejoice today that you are not asking the question, who is this man that commands winds and waves? But rejoice because you know the answer. He's Jesus, the storm-stilling Son of God. So, perhaps today, we might find a new boldness and faith that empowers us not to give the storms of life the satisfaction of our surprise. Because we know better than that. At least we should. The cross and empty tomb have told us that storms are always and ever will be an opportunity for God to light up the darkness with his glory, particularly the glory of his peace and his power, because all these storms, the big and the small, listen to his voice. Amen.